Welcome to Lesson 103, Opium and its Impact. This video will introduce opium as a narcotic, its arrival and popularity in China, its role in global trade, and its political and economic impact. So, what was opium exactly? Well, its main active ingredient is morphine, which represented about 3 to 4% of the type of opium that was brought to China from India. Codeine was another major active ingredient and could make up between 0.5% and perhaps 3%. Opium is addictive, but it's also psychotropic, meaning that, like nicotine, it does not lead to tolerance. Habitual smokers plateau at about 7 to 15 pipes per day. In the 19th and 20th centuries, most users were light or moderate in their consumption, and they did so often for medicinal or social purposes. Opium had both desirable and undesirable effects. On the positive side of the ledger, it stopped diarrhea, suppressed coughs, and both relieved pain and induced pleasure. In the American advertisement to the right from Sears, laudanum, an ingestible opium medication, was advertised as a cure-all for babies. On the negative side, it led to constipation, which is the opposite of diarrhea, slowed breathing, led sometimes to nausea or paranoia, and could produce addiction, a side effect, if you will, of its pleasurable qualities. Campaigners against opium during the 19th century did not necessarily understand the drug medically, but imagined it instead as a poison. One possible trope pictured here was the idea that insects were writhing within its smoke. Opium was not new in China. It first arrived sometime before the 11th century via traders from the Middle East. In this early period, it was ingested in concentrated quantities by elites. It was seen as a cure-all and often as an aphrodisiac. It was also deadly in this potent form. Among the Ming emperors, 11 out of 16 of them died before the age of 40. And while it is hard to draw a direct causal relationship for any of these early deaths, researchers have found that the Wanli Emperor, pictured here, had traces of morphine in his bones. Matic, or opium that was blended with tobacco and smoked, gained popularity beginning in the late 16th century. By the late 18th century, matic had given way to smoking pure opium. One advantage to smoking versus ingesting opium is that the process of smoking it destroys between 80 and 90% of the drug's active ingredients. Still, despite these earlier chapters of the drug's history in China, we probably would not be talking about opium if it wasn't for the large trade imbalance racked up in China by the British East India Company, a chartered monopoly that provided tea and porcelain to the British market. The company had trouble interesting Chinese traders in anything other than silver, and they were rapidly being drained of this scarce monetary resource. It was not until the company started bringing opium from India that they're able to start constructing a more profitable triangular trade. That trade would move from Britain to India, India to China, and then from China back to Britain. Production under the direction of the East India Company was nothing short of industrial in scale. These lithographs, based on scenes sketched by a British official, showed the operation step by step, up until the pricey narcotic was ready to sail for China. Upon arrival, the East India Company had no way to sell opium directly to Chinese consumers, or even take it ashore. Instead, British ships would anchor off the coast of Linton Island, where the illicit goods were then purchased by Chinese smugglers. The Chinese smugglers, in turn, would take these so-called scrambling dragon boats, rapid sailing that could bypass Chinese officials from Linton Island into the river basin. Opium sales surged between the late 1700s and the 1830s, eventually exceeding the value of the tea and other exports that had gone to the West. At this point, the silver flow reversed, which was arguably an even bigger problem for the Qing Empire than it had been for the East India Company. The Qing ran a bimetal currency system in which daily goods were purchased with copper cash or qian, and taxes were paid in silver taels or liang. When the cost of the silver tael rose above 100 copper cash, ordinary Chinese had to spend more to pay their taxes, which meant they had less money available for anything else that they wanted to buy at market. When enough people cut back or stopped buying goods entirely, the economy as a whole suffered. It is for this reason that we talk about the Daoguang era depression. This was named, of course, for the emperor, whose reign from 1820 to 1850 just happened to match the economic chaos unfolding around him. This depression featured failing banks, rising inequality, unpaid taxes, and rampant corruption. Opium, of course, was blamed, and fairly so, for much of these economic woes. At the same time, opium also provoked security fears, for those who could not pay their taxes would often revolt, and military readiness was at least feared to be declining as soldiers, just like many others, engaged in excessive opium smoking. The Daoguang Emperor was desperate by March of 1839 when he sent the no-nonsense Commissioner Lin Zexu to Guangzhou to put an end to the opium trade once and for all. He would lead a blockade, confiscate foreign drug holdings, chastise a very young Queen Victoria, and eventually lead his nation to a devastating defeat at the hands of the British.